There is a square mile on Earth where, for nearly 2,000 years, the same patch of riverbank has never stopped counting money. Empires have risen and collapsed. Currencies have been born and buried. Wars have redrawn the map of the world a dozen times over. And through all of it, this one square mile has remained an unbroken center of commerce, wealth, and power. Older than most nations, more enduring than most monarchies. To walk its streets today is to walk across layers of Roman stone, medieval ash, merchant gold, and modern glass, all pressed together into a single, impossibly small piece of ground. How does a square mile survive fire, plague, invasion, and revolution, and emerge each time more powerful than before? To understand that, we must go back to the very beginning, to a muddy bend in a river and a bridge that changed the world. In the year 43 of the Common Era, Roman legions crossed the English Channel under the command of Emperor Claudius, intent on adding Britannia to an empire that already stretched from Spain to Syria. The Romans were master engineers, and wherever they went, they looked for one thing above all else: a place where a river could be bridged and where ships could safely dock. They found it on the north bank of the River Thames, at the first point upstream, narrow enough to cross yet still deep enough for sea-going vessels. There, around the year 47, they founded a settlement they called Londinium. It was not at first a great capital. It was a practical outpost, a bridgehead, a supply depot, a place where roads met water. But practicality has a way of becoming permanence. Within a generation, Londinium had grown into a bustling port town, its wooden quays lined with amphorae of wine and olive oil shipped in from across the empire, its narrow streets filled with soldiers, merchants, and the enslaved people who built and served the growing town. That early prosperity was nearly extinguished before it truly began. In the year 60 or 61, the British Queen Boudicca led a revolt against Roman rule, and her forces burned Londinium to the ground, leaving behind a layer of scorched earth that archaeologists still find today beneath the modern city. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe. Yet the Romans rebuilt, and rebuilt more ambitiously than before. Londinium rose again with a forum, a basilica, a governor's palace, and eventually a great defensive wall, portions of which still stand in fragments across the modern city, silent witnesses to a settlement that refused to disappear. By the 2nd century, Londinium had become the largest city in Roman Britain, the administrative and commercial heart of the province. But Rome itself was not eternal. As the empire weakened and its legions withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, Londinium's fortunes collapsed with startling speed. Trade routes broke down, the population dwindled, and for a time the once thriving Roman city was largely abandoned, its stone buildings slowly swallowed by grass and silence. Historians still debate exactly how empty the walled city became during this period, but there is broad agreement that Anglo-Saxon settlement initially took root not within the old Roman walls but in a separate area to the west known as Lundenwic. It was only later, as Viking raids made the open settlement too vulnerable, that the Anglo-Saxon king Alfred the Great made a decisive choice. Around 886, he moved the settlement back inside the old, defensible Roman walls. That decision, to return to the walled square mile the Romans had first fortified, would shape the geography of power in England for the next 1,000 years. From that point forward, the city began to accumulate something more valuable than stone walls, institutions. Trade guilds formed to protect the interests of merchants and craftsmen. Markets grew along streets whose names still echo their medieval trades. Bread Street, Milk Street, Poultry, Cheapside, from the Old English word seep, meaning to buy or barter. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, London was already the wealthiest and most populous city in England, and William the Conqueror understood that ruling it required not force alone, but negotiation. Rather than crushing the city's independence, William granted London a charter confirming its ancient rights and customs, a remarkably pragmatic gesture from a conqueror. It was an early sign of a pattern that would define the city for centuries to come. London's merchants would trade loyalty and taxation for the preservation of their own self-governance. If you're finding this journey through history as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing. There are many more stories like this one still to come, from ancient empires to the cities that outlasted them. That self-governance deepened dramatically in 1215, the same fateful year that English barons forced King John to seal Magna Carta at Runnymede. Tucked within that historic document was a specific clause guaranteeing that the City of London should enjoy its ancient liberties and free customs, both by land and by water. It was a small clause with enormous consequences. It meant that even as English kings ruled their kingdom, the City of London retained a measure of self-rule unmatched almost anywhere else in medieval Europe. Its own courts, its own elected officials, and eventually its own Lord Mayor, a position first recorded in the late 12th century and formally established in the years that followed. Kings needed London's money to fund their wars and their courts, and London's merchants understood the value of that leverage. Time and again throughout medieval history, English monarchs who tried to override the city's privileges found themselves needing its loans too badly to press the point. Commerce flowed through London like blood through a heart. Along the crowded wharves of the Thames, ships arrived bearing wool, wine, timber, and spices, while London's own exports, above all English wool, transformed into cloth, sailed outward to markets across Flanders, France, and the Baltic. Powerful trade guilds, known as livery companies, rose to dominate different corners of this commerce, the mercers dealing in fine textiles, the goldsmiths shaping precious metal into coin and ornament, the grocers controlling the spice trade, the fishmongers regulating the catch that fed a growing population. These guilds were not merely economic associations, they were centers of civic power, charitable giving, religious devotion, and political influence, and many of their grand halls, rebuilt and restored across the centuries, still stand today as living monuments to that medieval prosperity. Yet London's story was never one of unbroken triumph. In 1348, the Black Death arrived on English shores, and by some estimates it killed nearly half the population of London within a matter of months. Streets that had bustled with merchants and craftsmen fell terrifyingly silent. And yet, as it had after Boudicca's fire more than 1,000 years earlier, the city endured. Labour shortages following the plague actually shifted economic power towards surviving workers and merchants, subtly accelerating changes already reshaping English society. The city's institutions, its guilds, its courts, its charters, proved resilient enough to survive catastrophe and continue functioning once the worst had passed. By the 16th and 17th centuries, London's ambitions had grown far beyond the boundaries of England itself. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of London merchants, creating the English East India Company. It would become one of the most powerful commercial enterprises the world had ever seen, eventually commanding its own private armies and administering vast territories across the Indian subcontinent, all while headquartered not in a royal palace, but in a City of London trading house. Fortunes beyond imagination flowed back through the square mile, funding new ventures, new buildings, and an ever-expanding web of international finance. It was around this same era that goldsmiths, originally craftsmen who worked in precious metal, began quietly transforming themselves into something new. Wealthy Londoners, wary of unstable royal mints and the risks of storing coin at home, began depositing their gold with trusted goldsmiths for safekeeping. In exchange, these goldsmiths issued receipts, promises to pay the bearer on demand. Merchants soon discovered that these paper receipts could be exchanged directly, without ever touching the gold itself. Almost imperceptibly, London's goldsmiths had invented an early form of banknote, and with it, the foundations of modern English banking. Few people living through this quiet transformation could have imagined that their handwritten promises would one day evolve into the paper currency that would circulate around the entire globe. But the greatest transformation had yet to begin. In September of 1666, a fire broke out in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, in the heart of the city. Fed by tightly packed timber buildings, dry summer conditions and strong winds, the flames spread with terrifying speed. Over 4 days, the Great Fire of London consumed roughly 13,000 houses, nearly 90 parish churches, and the medieval Cathedral of St. Paul's itself, leaving the ancient heart of the city a smoking ruin. It was, in material terms, one of the greatest urban catastrophes in English history. And yet, remarkably, official records suggest the loss of life was small compared to the scale of destruction. Out of those ashes rose an opportunity for reinvention. The architect Christopher Wren, along with other visionaries, proposed sweeping plans to rebuild London as a city of grand avenues and classical grandeur. Property disputes and the pressures of commerce meant the medieval street pattern was largely preserved, but the buildings themselves rose anew in brick and stone rather than timber, safer and more permanent than what had come before. Wren's masterpiece, the new St. Paul's Cathedral, would rise over the following decades to dominate London's skyline for centuries, its dome becoming an enduring symbol of the city's resilience. If this story of resilience and reinvention is capturing your imagination, let us know in the comments. Which historic city do you believe has shaped world history the most? Out of the fire's ashes and amid the growing complexity of overseas trade, new institutions took root that would define London's financial character for centuries. Ships sailing to distant markets faced genuine peril, storms, piracy, shipwreck, and merchants needed a way to share that risk. In the late 17th century, a coffee house opened by Edward Lloyd on Tower Street became an unlikely meeting place for ship owners, merchants, and underwriters who gathered to exchange shipping news and arrange marine insurance over cups of coffee. What began as informal conversation between acquaintances gradually evolved into one of the most sophisticated insurance markets in the world, eventually formalized as Lloyd's of London. The model was elegantly simple, yet profoundly important. Individuals would pledge their personal wealth to cover a portion of a given risk, spreading potential losses so that no single catastrophe could ruin any one underwriter. This system of shared risk gave English merchants a confidence their competitors often lacked, and it encouraged bolder, more ambitious ventures across the oceans. Coffee houses across the city became crucibles of finance in this period, filled with the aroma of roasted beans and the murmur of deals being struck. At another such establishment known as Jonathan's Coffee House, brokers gathered to trade shares in joint stock companies, exchanging ownership in overseas ventures the way earlier generations had traded wool or spices. Trading eventually grew too large and too rowdy for a single coffee house to contain, and in 1801 formal rules were established for what became the London Stock Exchange, giving structure and regulation to a market that had, until then, operated largely on trust, reputation, and the unwritten codes of gentlemen who valued their word above written contracts. Yet ambition in London's financial world was not without its darker chapters. In 1720, speculative frenzy surrounding the South Sea Company sent share prices soaring to absurd heights before the bubble collapsed catastrophically, ruining investors across English society, including members of Parliament and the aristocracy. The episode became a sobering lesson in the dangers of unchecked financial speculation, one that shaped attitudes toward regulation and caution in the city for generations afterward. Historians continue to debate exactly how much fraud versus simple mania drove the collapse, but there is little disagreement that it left deep scars on London's financial memory. Despite such setbacks, the 18th and 19th centuries saw the City of London consolidate its position as the financial capital of the world. The Bank of England, founded in 1694 to help finance a war against France, grew steadily into the institution regulating the nation's currency and credit, its imposing headquarters on Threadneedle Street, eventually earning it the affectionate nickname, the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street. As the British Empire expanded across the 19th century, London's financial institutions financed railways in India, mines in South Africa, and infrastructure projects on nearly every inhabited continent. Capital raised within the square mile built ports, laid telegraph cables, and funded enterprises thousands of miles from the narrow streets where the money itself originated. Insurance underwriters at Lloyd's assessed risk on ships circling the globe. Merchant banks arranged financing for governments as well as private companies. It was a concentration of financial expertise unlike anything the world had seen before, all packed within roughly 1 square mile of ancient streets that still, in places, followed paths first walked by Roman soldiers. Throughout these centuries of expanding wealth, the city preserved traditions that linked its modern prosperity to its ancient origins. Each year, the installation of a new Lord Mayor was, and remains, marked by an elaborate procession through the streets, a ceremony whose roots stretch back into the medieval period, a living reminder that the city's governance had never been entirely absorbed into the wider machinery of national government. The great livery companies continued their charitable work and ceremonial functions, their historic halls hosting banquets, much as they had centuries before. Even the boundary stones marking the edge of the city's ancient jurisdiction remained in use, quiet markers of a self-governing territory whose origins reached back to Roman fortifications. What followed would permanently reshape the very meaning of commerce, as the city's financial institutions grew ever more intertwined, each innovation building upon the last. The marine insurance pioneered at Lloyd's inspired new forms of insurance, covering fire, life, and eventually nearly every conceivable risk. The banking practices born from goldsmiths' receipts evolved into a sophisticated system of checks, clearing houses, and credit that allowed enormous sums to move with only the barest physical exchange of coin. The stock exchange, born of coffeehouse gossip, matured into a disciplined market-moving capital toward the ventures judged most promising by generations of investors. Each of these institutions had begun almost accidentally, born from practical need rather than grand design, yet together they formed a financial ecosystem of extraordinary depth and resilience. Before we reach the end of this remarkable story, if you've enjoyed traveling through nearly 2,000 years of history with us, please consider subscribing for more documentaries exploring the great civilizations and cities that shaped our world. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how improbable this history truly is. A muddy river crossing chosen by Roman engineers for purely practical reasons became, through repeated destruction and equally repeated rebirth, one of the most significant financial centers in human history. It survived a Queen's fire in the 1st century, a plague-emptied silence in the 5th, the devastation of the Black Death in the 14th, and a catastrophic inferno in the 17th, and each time it did not merely recover, it emerged transformed, more sophisticated, more essential than before. Few square miles of ground anywhere on Earth carry so dense a layering of continuous human ambition. Beneath its pavements lie Roman mosaics and the ash of Boudicca's rebellion. Within its ancient boundaries stand livery halls whose charitable traditions predate the printing press, alongside institutions whose innovations in risk, credit, and exchange rewrote the rules of global commerce. Kings and queens who ruled vast territories nonetheless found themselves negotiating again and again with the merchants and aldermen of this single square mile because the wealth concentrated within its walls could not simply be commanded. It had to be persuaded, courted, and respected. There is something profoundly human at the heart of this story. It was not conquerors or armies who built London's enduring power, but generations of ordinary merchants, craftsmen, goldsmiths, and coffeehouse patrons, each making small, practical decisions to solve immediate problems. How to move goods safely, how to store wealth securely, how to share the risk of a voyage across a dangerous sea. None of them could have foreseen that their solutions would compound across centuries into a financial architecture spanning the globe. And yet that is precisely what happened. One guild charter, one insurance policy, one handwritten banknote at a time. The City of London stands today as a testament to an idea both simple and extraordinary, that resilience, patiently rebuilt after every catastrophe, and self-governance, jealously guarded through 1,000 years of kings and revolutions, can transform a single square mile of riverside mud into one of the most consequential places in the entire history of human civilization. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with fellow history enthusiasts. Because the story of how power, commerce, and ambition converged upon one small stretch of the Thames is, in many ways, the story of the modern world itself, written one century, one fire, and one fortune at a time.